Hello, welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Pride and Prejudice. Chapter 7, A Romantic Entanglement. The next day, Elizabeth told Jane what had passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. Could Darcy be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's friendship? Yet it was not in her nature to question the truthfulness who seemed as nice as Wickham did. Can Mr. Darcy's closest friend be so deceived by him? Jane wondered. I can't believe Mr. Bingley's being so ignorant of the facts, replied her sister. But why would Mr. Wickham make up such a story? If it's untrue, let Mr. Darcy contradict it. I don't know what to think, said a distressed Jane. I know exactly what to think, replied determined Elizabeth. The two young ladies were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Bingley and his sisters. They came with their personal invitation to the long-expected ball at Netherfield. The idea of the Netherfield ball was eagerly anticipated by every Bennet girl who dreamed of romance of dashing young gentlemen. Jane pictured to herself a happy evening in the company of Mr. Bingley, while Elizabeth thought of dancing with Mr. Wickham. Not only were the girls invited, even Mr. Collins was included in the Bingley's hospitality. He immediately asked Elizabeth for 2 dances. Elizabeth was caught off guard. She expected to share these dances with Wickham. Still, Mr. Collins' offer was accepted with as much grace as a disappointed girl could muster. Then it hit her. He meant to propose to her. She had noticed his increasingly friendliness to her. Even her mother thought Mr. Collins a good match. Elizabeth, however, pretended not to take the hint. Until Elizabeth entered the drawing room at Netherfield and looked in vain for Mr. Wickham, she never doubted he'd be there. Had he been purposely not invited by the Bingleys on Mr. Darcy's behalf? Elizabeth was very suspicious. In his absence, Elizabeth had to keep her promise to dance with Mr. Collins. He was so awkward and a terrible dancing partner. Elizabeth's poor feet were the proof. She danced with an officer. Then, before she took her next breath, Mr. Darcy took her by the hand and led her on the dance floor. For the longest time, they didn't speak. It is your turn to say something, Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth exclaimed after commenting on the music. Do you always talk while you're dancing, he asked. Sometimes. It would look odd to be entirely silent, she answered. So we asked her if she and her sisters were often walked into Meryton. She said yes, and then added, when you met us here, we had just made a new acquaintance. The effect of her words were immediate. A deep shade of red splashed all over his face, but he said nothing. Finally he spoke. Mr. Wickham is blessed with such manners that ensure he makes friends. I'm not as convinced, however, that he can keep them. Well, Elizabeth retorted, he's your friendship, and he'll suffer for it all his life. Darcy did not reply to her accusation. He quickly changed the subject of books. But Elizabeth was not to be ignored. I remember you once told me that you hardly forgave anyone. You must be really careful in your judgments, then. I am, he said in a firm voice. And are you never blinded by prejudice? Elizabeth asked pointedly. I hope not. But may I ask why all these questions? I'm just trying to decide the kind of man you are, she said, as they separated. Elizabeth was unmoved by her discussion, but Darcy felt himself overpowered by his feelings for her. Then they parted only a moment when Miss Bingley came forward to Elizabeth with a nasty look on her face. I hear you are taken with George Wickham. Did he tell you he was the son of the late Mr. Darcy's butler? He claims Mr. Darcy treated him badly. This is untrue. I don't know the particulars, but I know Mr. Darcy is not to blame for any such treatment. According to you, his guilt and his birth are the same thing, said Elizabeth angrily. I have heard nothing worse than being the son of a butler, and he told me that himself. You must mistake me if you expect information to influence me with such an attack. I see nothing in it but your ignorance and Mr. Darcy's malice. Miss Bingley turned away with a sneer, and Elizabeth was joined by Jane. Mr. Bingley does not know the whole story between Wickham and Darcy, but he will vouch for the good conduct of his friend, said Jane. He believes that Wickham is not a respectable man. Mr. Bingley does not know Wickham himself? Asked Elizabeth. No, said Jane. Then the account he has received is from Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley's defense of his friend is admirable, but he's not a reliable source of information if he has no first-hand information, cautioned Elizabeth. The sisters discussed happier matters, such as Jane's delight and Bingley's attentiveness. Elizabeth could see that the two had a deep love for one another. Jane could enjoy all the blessings of marriage of true love. Elizabeth wasn't alone in her sentiments. Her mother could talk of nothing else. Elizabeth tried to stop her mother from boasting of Jane's future possibilities in public, but her effort was hopeless. Mrs. Bennet was a vain and silly woman who often embarrassed her daughters. Not surprisingly, Mrs. Bennet returned to Longbourn in high spirits, convinced that her favorite child, Jane, would soon be settled in Netherfield, and poor Elizabeth would eventually marry silly Mr. Collins. And that's the end of that chapter. See you later.